Have you ever wondered what happens in the cockpit when miscommunication occurs? In today's Shadows of History episode, we investigate a near disaster involving a Boeing 777. Join us as we explore the critical moments that almost resulted in tragedy and the lessons learned from this intense flight experience. On December 18, 2022, the Hawaiian Islands were influenced by a severe winter storm moving up from the southwest, bringing heavy thunderstorms, gusty winds, and intense hail. During these conditions, the job of pilots and air traffic controllers becomes highly complicated, as many aircraft are forced to abandon their expected arrival and departure routes to avoid flying through storm cells. Even outside of these worst cells, moderate to severe turbulence can occur, making flying unpleasant, and that is precisely what happened on this particular day. On the ground in Maui, two United Airlines pilots sat in a shuttle bus transporting them from their hotel to Kahului Airport, where they were scheduled to fly United Airlines Flight 1722 to San Francisco. They could see the rain pouring down outside their car windows and the palm trees battered by the gusty winds. They knew the flight would start slowly, but airline pilots expect that. Both pilots were well rested and in a positive mood. It was around lunchtime, and aside from the departure weather, they were looking forward to a pleasant flight. The aircraft they planned to fly was a 22-year-old Boeing 777-222. There were no open technical issues, and the plane arrived in Maui while the two pilots approached the airport. On the inbound flight, the 8 cabin crew members were on board, and they would later fly back to San Francisco with these pilots on their second flight of the day. When this incident was reported in the media, there was much speculation about whether these pilots were part of a wave of inexperienced new hires and, thus, a sign of a potentially dangerous trend within the industry caused by the looming pilot shortage. So, was that the case? You could answer both yes and no in this case. The 55-year-old captain had over 19,600 hours of flight time, 5,000 of which had been on the Boeing 777. That's an admirable accomplishment, but as my friend Juan Brown on the Blanco Lirio channel pointed out, only 300 of those 777 hours were spent flying as a captain. The final report does not explicitly state this, but it is possible that the captain flew on the Airbus A320 between his co-pilot 777 experience and his return to it as a captain. That is commonly done on major airlines. If that's the case, the captain in the 777's left seat must be relatively new. Juan pointed out in his video that the Airbus and Boeing 777 are handled differently despite being fly-by-wire aircraft. If you point an Airbus's nose in the right direction with your side stick, it will auto-trim that direction. However, as with any other Boeing aircraft, you must trim the 777 and react to any forces caused by the underslung engines and flaps. These types of handling differences may become significant under stress. The co-pilot was also quite experienced, with approximately 5,300 hours total, but he had only 120 hours on this particular type. This likely indicated that he was new to the company. Again, the final report did not specify this. However, such a lack of experience could be the cause of one of the misunderstandings that will lay the groundwork for what is to come. While sitting in their shuttle bus, the pilots decided to make the most of their time and began reviewing their pre-flight briefing. The captain contacted a United Airlines dispatcher, who informed him of the severe weather conditions surrounding the Hawaiian Islands. They then decided on a new alternate route to take them away from the most severe parts of the storm. The two pilots also examined the aircraft's technical status, which was satisfactory, as well as the NOTAMs, which appeared to be in order. The departure weather was unquestionably the most significant issue. When they arrived at the airport, the first officer purchased a sandwich and coffee before heading directly to the gate where the aircraft had just arrived. As they boarded and introduced themselves to the crew, the purser or head cabin crew, they began by telling them about the very turbulent arrival they had just flown through, which only highlighted the complicated weather ahead of them. The captain thanked the purser for the update and informed the crew that he wanted them to remain seated after departure, to ensure the expected turbulence injured no one. The purser agreed, and the captain, the pilot flying the leg, went into the cockpit and began preparing for departure, while the first officer went outside to do the walk-around. By the sounds of it, it was First Officer Weather for the walk-around. While performing the pre-flight inspection, the first officer received a text message from a friend informing him of a severe turbulence incident on a Hawaiian Airlines flight arriving in Maui. Multiple people were injured on that flight, which I may feature in another episode later. When the first officer entered the cockpit, he showed the captain the text message, and they agreed to depart cautiously. They continued to prepare the aircraft and complete the briefings as the crew boarded the 271 passengers scheduled for the flight. When it came time for the performance calculations, the first officer attempted to use the ATIS, but it did not work for some reason, so he had to call the tower instead. The tower advised them that the winds were light, coming from the south at around 10 knots. They were presently using runway 20 for departure. The first officer, who had extensive prior experience flying between the Hawaiian Islands, commented that it was unusual that runway 20 was being used. Still, it was most likely due to the complicated weather conditions affecting arrivals. Because the winds were relatively light, their performance software, Sabre, recommended that flaps 20 and a reduced thrust be used for departure. Derated thrust indicates that the engines will not produce full thrust when the takeoff thrust is set. Instead, they will only make enough to ensure a safe takeoff, with all applicable margins taken into account, and we pilots will decide how much derate to use based on the outside circumstances. If possible, we always use reduced takeoff thrust because it produces less noise, consumes less fuel, and most importantly saves a lot of engine wear, extending engine life. Now, we would only use full thrust if takeoff performance required it, or if there were environmental reasons to do so, such as extreme crosswinds or a wind shear warning. This departure had another oddity, which I will explain shortly. Before we go any further, I'd like to give a big shout out to today's sponsor, NordVPN, whose product I'm increasingly using because it allows me to virtually move to pretty much anywhere in the world at the touch of a button. This has allowed me to follow my favorite Swedish hockey team, Modo Hockey, from my home in Spain and watch other geofenced content, but that's not all. I also frequently use Nord to look for better deals when booking rental cars, hotels, and even flights, as the app allows me to avoid the dynamic pricing that many of these companies use today. Although this may seem unfair to those companies, we can change prices based on location. Furthermore, Nord is a defense against people attempting to snoop on your data, place unwanted cookies, and do other illicit things. Still, it would help to exercise extreme caution when dealing with suspicious email links and other similar situations. If you want to try NordVPN, use the link below, nordvpn.com/pilot. Clicking on that link will give you 4 months for free when you sign up for a 2-year contract. Plus, you'll be supporting my channel. Remember, Nord always offers a full 30-day money-back guarantee. Thanks, Nord. Now, back to the story. As previously stated, the pilots chose flap 20 for departure, which is significant given that flap 15 is the most common takeoff setting on the Boeing 777-200. A curious thing about the 777 is that if flaps 20 are used for takeoff when flap retraction is initiated, the pilots will not go from flaps 20 to 15, which is the next flap step, but will instead go directly to flaps 5 and skip flap 15. So this is what the captain intended to do, as he had throughout his 777 career thus far. Another topic worth discussing is how the various flap settings and their maximum speeds are displayed on the pilot's primary flight displays. The minimum flap speeds are typically displayed as a minor bug, with a corresponding number on the speed tape on the left side of the primary flight display. In the case of a flaps 20 departure, the flaps 20 bug may not be visible. However, when the nose is lowered to accelerate and a positive speed trend is observed, the pilot flying will call for flaps 5, and the pilot monitoring will first verify that the speed is safe before selecting wings 5. This procedure will then be repeated as the speed increases, so that when flaps 5 are passed, flaps 1 are selected, and so on, until the flaps are fully retracted. Because flaps and slats significantly increase the wing's overall area and curvature, They are subject to certain maximum speed limits. The more flaps you select, the lower the maximum speed, represented on the speed tape as an alternating black and red barber's pole. If we exceed this maximum speed for a given flap setting, we risk damaging the flap mechanism, so we must report any flap overspeed to the engineer so that the proper maintenance check can be performed. As a result, we continually monitor the speed tape while accelerating to ensure that the barber's poles continue to move up as we retract the flaps. If they don't, this could be a sign of a flap problem, such as the flaps becoming stuck or skewed. All of this will become increasingly relevant shortly. When the pilots were fully prepared, they contacted Maui Tower to request pushback and startup clearance. This was received, and during the pushback, the pilots could hear that the wind was beginning to vary between 0-30 degrees and 190 degrees, that low-level wind shear warnings were in effect, and that the runway in use had been changed from runway 20 to runway 02. As I previously stated, wind shear, which occurs when the wind abruptly changes direction or intensity, is one of the reasons that derated takeoff thrust is not permitted. This is because if the aircraft encounters wind shear, it will require all the engine thrust margins it can obtain. The pilots finished their pushback and engine start, went into their FMC, and updated their plans for the new runway. They again chose flaps 20 as the departure flap setting, but this time with full thrust. They also manually entered V1, rotation, and V2 speeds, but they used the speeds associated with the derated takeoff because they were both allowed by the United SOP and more conservative. When performing a full thrust takeoff, remember that if no wind shear is present, the aircraft will accelerate and climb faster than usual due to the excess thrust. As they taxied out, the pilots found themselves in a line of departing aircraft, and they used this time to carefully brief what actions they would take in the event of a predictive wind shear warning during the takeoff roll or an actual wind shear once airborne. They eventually arrived at the holding point and were directed to line up and wait on runway 02 behind a departing Airbus A321. They did so, and since they now had to wait a few minutes to gain enough separation from the preceding aircraft, they had plenty of time to examine the weather radar image on their navigation display and ensure that there were no storm cells in their immediate departure direction. The captain had weather radar selected on his navigation display, while the first officer had terrain, which is a reasonably standard setting for a departure like this. 1449 United Airlines Flight 1722 was cleared for takeoff from runway 02. The surface wind was then reported to be 140 degrees at 10 knots, with moderate rain. They turned on their windshield wipers too high. The captain moved his thrust levers forward to stabilize the engines before pushing toga, which activated the auto throttle and set the full takeoff thrust. The aircraft accelerated rapidly down the runway due to the higher than normal thrust setting. Still, the rotation was utterly regular, with the gear retracted and an initial climb attitude of 12 to 15 degrees. The aircraft quickly gained altitude and soon encountered moderate turbulence, causing its speed to fluctuate. At this point, the captain was flying manually, and he most likely had to work very hard while also judging the departure ahead to ensure that no storm cells formed. When the aircraft reached 1,000 feet, the auto throttle reduced the thrust from takeoff to climb acceleration, which coincided with the minimum flap retraction altitude. This meant that the captain lowered the nose slightly to accelerate the aircraft and retract the flaps, and things would start to happen quickly. Everything I'm about to tell you happened in less than 30 seconds, which is worth remembering. As the speed increased, the captain ordered flaps 5 to be selected. He then looked down at his speed tape and noticed that the maximum speed for his current flap setting was quickly approaching. The first officer thought he heard the captain call for flap 15, and since that was the next flap step, he didn't believe in questioning it. This may not have seemed like an unusual command since he only had 120 hours on the type. At the same time that the captain requested this new flap setting, the tower controller called and asked them to switch to Honolulu control. The first officer responded to this call by switching to the departure frequency and then selecting flaps 15 while calling the new controller up. He was immediately cleared to continue climbing to 16,000 feet. and the controller informed him that there was extreme precipitation in all quadrants and that they were free to avoid the weather at their discretion. The first officer returned the message before setting the mode control panel to 16,000 feet and selecting weather radar on his navigation display. While this happened, the captain continued looking at his primary flight display. He expected the barber's poles to begin moving up to the flap 5 maximum speed, but he suspected they were moving in the opposite direction because it was still accelerating. In reality, the maximum speed increased slightly, but only by about 20 knots rather than the 40 knots he expected. He saw the speed rapidly growing and realized that this would most likely result in a flap overspeed. To minimize this, he decided to override the auto throttle and slightly reduce the thrust. This caused the enormous underslung engines to decelerate slightly, resulting in a slight downward pitch momentum that caused the aircraft to pitch forward, but it was still climbing. Remember that you still need to trim and care for the plane on a Boeing, especially during configuration changes. The captain's attention was now drawn to what was happening with the flaps. In his mind, the flaps should have been moving to flaps 5, and since that was not happening, he began looking at the ECAS to see if there was any emergency procedure that needed to be followed. When nothing was there and no chimes had been heard, he called flaps 5 again, twice, and then looked at the first officer to confirm that he was indeed selecting 5. However, because this required him to divert his attention away from his primary flight display for approximately 10 seconds to figure this out, the captain failed to notice that the nose's downward pitch motion had continued, and it had now moved to around 0 degrees pitch and was still moving. The first officer noticed this and thought it was strange that the captain was pitching forward in response to a high-speed event. Still, because of the moderate turbulence, he wasn't sure if the captain was reacting to handling difficulties, wind shear, or if they had an instrumentation problem. Remember that everything happened in the span of a few seconds. He asked the captain about the pitch, but received no immediate response. Instead, the captain requested flap 1, probably still concerned and focused on the impending flap overspeed situation. Another possible explanation for the captain's pitch-forward input is somatogravic illusion. This was not mentioned in the final report. Still, because the aircraft was accelerating here, and the captain was looking away from his instruments, his inner ear may have misinterpreted the acceleration as a slight pitch-up. Our balance organs cannot distinguish between an acceleration and a pitch-up because they similarly affect the tiny hairs in our inner ears. That means he may have reacted to the perceived pitch-up without realizing it. It would not have been the first time that a somatogenic illusion caused a pitch down of this magnitude. In this series, I previously covered the Atlas Air Flight 3591 crash, in which somatogravic illusion was a major contributing factor. Check out the video after this one. The aircraft had reached a maximum altitude of approximately 2,000 feet before diving into the water below. According to the first officer, the first GPWS warning was a "don't sink" command, quickly followed by sink rate and pull up. At this point, the first officer noticed a movement in the clouds out of his peripheral vision. He saw the sea approaching them as they broke through the clouds. This is when he realized how dangerous their current situation was. The aircraft was now pitching down more than 10 degrees, and it was only getting worse. The captain ordered the flaps to be raised while the first officer and GPWS shouted, "Pull up," simultaneously. At an altitude of 1,386 feet, the highest vertical speed was 8,536 feet per minute, and the lowest pitch was around -15 degrees. The captain immediately responded by pulling up on his control wheel, while the GPWS continued to call out, "Too low. Terrain." This pull caused a vertical G loading of around 2.66 grams, and finally, as the aircraft reached its lowest point of 748 feet above the sea, the giant 777 began moving its nose back towards the sky. The captain initially reduced the thrust slightly, most likely to avoid the flap overspeed they were still experiencing. However, they quickly increased the thrust by their controlled flight into terrain, CFIT, and escape maneuvers. The aircraft pitched to 23 degrees nose up and reached a maximum climb speed of 8,680 feet per minute before the captain returned the nose to the flight directors, reset the trim, and activated the autopilot. It only took about 10 seconds for the captain to look away from his primary flight display and arrive at the most critical point of this incident. This demonstrates how quickly things can change if you lose concentration during a crucial phase of flight, particularly in challenging conditions like this. The crew continued climbing toward their cruise altitude, avoiding storm cells and moderate turbulence for the duration of the climb. Once they had leveled off, the captain contacted the purser to inquire about the status of both the passengers and the crew. Fortunately, they had all been seated with their seatbelts fastened during this ordeal, and they had anticipated some severe turbulence, so they were all fine. And because there was no indication of anything wrong with the aircraft, the crew decided to continue their flight to San Francisco. The pilots debriefed during the cruise and filed one report each when they returned to the base, as was proper. Subsequently, they made an approach and landed safely in San Francisco. However, the aircraft had already recorded the flap exceedance, so they were greeted by engineers upon arrival to check on the flaps. Even though the pilots reported the occurrence through the proper channels, a thorough inquiry was not initiated initially. Only approximately 2 months later, the Air Current mentioned the incident in one of their outstanding stories, and the FAA and NTSB began their investigations. Unfortunately, by that time, both the cockpit voice and the flight data recorder had been erased. Thus, this account is based on interviews with the pilots, ADSB data, and anything they could extract from the aircraft quick access recorder. The assessment concluded that the incident was caused by a misunderstanding between the pilots, which failed to manage the aircraft's vertical flight path, airspeed, and pitch attitude. The investigation resulted in United Airlines altering one of its pilot training courses and launching an intercompany awareness campaign outlining what had occurred and what could be learned. Before everyone begins commenting in the comments below about how irresponsible this was and how it could never happen to them, consider how many times you've looked away for a few seconds while driving your car. Things like this happen, and as an industry, we learn from them by improving training and pilot awareness. These reports are intended for precisely this purpose. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe and enable notifications for more fascinating historical stories. See you next time.